Hello, everyone. My name is Langston Clark, and I'm the founder and organizer of Entrepreneurial Appetites Black Book Discussions, a series of events dedicated to building community, promoting intellectualism, and supporting Black businesses. And today we have a very special conversation with Dr. Anthea Butler, author of White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, and a good friend of mine from graduate school, Ariel Griffin, who does racial justice work in her church, which is a predominantly white church. And so I figured it would be a great opportunity to have someone who is in our book reading community take part in the conversation with the author. And so before we get started in today's conversation, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we do with Entrepreneurial Appetite. For those of you who support what we do, our patrons, a percentage of everything that you give goes to an endowment that I started with 3 colleagues of mine who are all graduates of North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University and HBCU. The endowment is called the From A&T to PhD Endowed Scholarship, and it was also started by my good friend, future Dr. Brittany Patrick and Dr. Terrell Morton, and it's part of our efforts to build a community of support for our HBCU. And so now, also want to show you another podcast that I started with some of my friends, Dr. Alvin Logan and Dr. Brandon Kroom. We have collaborated to take some of the content from a course that we teach called African Americans in Sport, where we bring experts in the African American sporting experience via podcast format for our listeners and our students. And so without further ado, I'm going to start today's conversation. I think we may have lost Ariel, or she turned off her camera. I'm not sure. Oh, there she is. She's back. And so I'm going to have Ariel start us off with the conversation with Dr. Butler. But Ariel, why don't you introduce yourself first, and then Dr. Butler, if you could talk a little bit about your work and what you do, that'd be great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Hello and welcome everyone, and a special welcome to Dr. Butler. Once again, my name is Ariel. You can call me Ari. So I personally was really excited when I first heard about this event, immediately went to Amazon and bought your book, Dr. Butler, because the title in itself is just extremely provoking. But not only that, it is very connected to the work that I do, both paid and unpaid, right? So I personally, as someone who grew up in a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri, in a predominantly white church my whole entire life, I've had moments in Black churches, but mostly a lot of my spiritual formation has been in a white church. And so I, now working as a youth minister with middle schoolers and high schoolers in a church that is once again predominantly white, it has been very interesting reading your book, specifically because those gaps in history that many of us never learned in our time in white spaces, or many of us never learned in the history books, you filled in a lot of those gaps. And it was really helpful to see a historian speak in a way that it's not dry, it's not boring, but it was kind of convicting for me, because I started to ask myself questions that, have I been complicit in some of the systems just by participating, and in the times that I didn't say anything, before I was fully embracing my whole identity as a Black woman of faith. So that's just how I come to the table. And so I'm just gonna kick the first question to you. As Langston mentioned, just really interested to hear, what might not be in your bio. So what was it that led you to start putting together this book?
Experience with white evangelicals and being a historian. I think, I occupy kind of a strange space to be writing about this. Most of the books about evangelicalism right now are by people who are in the evangelical movement. I made a distinct decision to leave it and go back to Catholicism. So that's one. But evangelicals usually don't think I know them, but I know them all too well. I went to Evangelical Seminary, Fuller. I graduated with my PhD from Vanderbilt. And I've been teaching now for 13 years at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm the Geraldine R. Siegel Professor of American Social Thought. I say all that to say this. Somebody made a very interesting comment on Twitter the other day and said, why don't the white guys come after you the same way? And I said, well, and they said, is it because, X, or because, she is where she is, or she has the, I got the receipts, right? And I think that this book is about receipts, and they're the receipts that have not been told to people either in church environments or by historians or by people who have written evangelical histories who really want to write a certain kind of history so that it makes evangelicals look really good. And I got tired of reading that history, and I'm like, there's another history here, and people need to know about it, need to interrogate it, and they need to decide, what am I doing here, and why am I here with white Jesus and white people, and what are they doing, and do they really even care about me, or is all this a show? And I think that while the book may not answer all those questions for individuals, I think what the book does do is, like you say, acts as a convicting mechanism. I just wrote a history, and I wrote that history for a variety of reasons, but most importantly, to show that morality is a shield. Morality is something that evangelicals use to hide the things that they really want to do instead of the things that they think that they're supposed to be doing. And I think that Donald Trump really showed that, but I didn't want to deal with Trump because this happened a long time before Trump.
Thank you so much. There was so much good stuff there. So I'm like, which direction should we go? Because I got a lot of questions. So let's just start with, you mentioned how you are an ex-evangelist or evangelist.
I don't know if I would say I was an ex-evangelical. That people like to use that term. I was always baptized in the Catholic Church. Once you're baptized in the Catholic Church, according to a historian, you're always there. They don't take you out unless they excommunicate you. So maybe I dabbled and then I came back.
Okay, so my question here is, you dabbled and went back to Catholicism, and oftentimes I'm seeing that you talked about in your book, White Jesus, and you go through the whitewashing of the Christian faith and how evangelicals have perpetuated that. And the first thing that I thought as I was reading it, for me, it brought tears to my eyes because I've seen people actually completely leave the faith because of that. Mm-hmm. And I've actually seen people join other religions and things like that because of that. So what led you back to Catholicism and not just completely leaving the church?
Oh, it's not even a racial story. That's the great part. It wasn't a racial story. It's about the Nicene Creed. I was in an early church history class at Fuller, and the professor was breaking down the Nicene Creed, and I realized I had been saying something that was made in 325 AD, and that I should have been paying attention to it, and nobody in the Catholic Church had paid attention to it. And so through a process of discernment and spiritual direction, I came back. It wasn't really racial. I have to say that it really wasn't racial at all, my going back. What it was more about intellectual, because I felt like, evangelicals at times are not very intellectual. They tend to want to lean on feeling more than they want to lean on facts. And that's part of the problem, I think. And that's why this book is chock full of facts, and it ain't about feelings.
That is real. That is real. So one of the things that you have mentioned even in this talk, but is very clear, if I could pinpoint one value that was strong from the beginning to the end, it's truth. And the first thing that comes to my mind is the Bible verse that says the truth shall set you free. Yeah. And so I guess if you could pinpoint one truth that is the most important in this book, because there's a lot of truths. You've spoken a lot of truths in this book. What's one truth that the reader should be walking away with knowing?
Racism is a feature, not a bug of American evangelicalism. Mm. It is a feature, not a bug. It's not a mistake. It's not something that's there. Evangelicalism and racism are embedded together. And once you understand that, you understand what the movement has been about. Mm.
So I'm gonna.
I know that's hard. You take a breath, because you need to sit with that. It is a feature, not a bug. It is part and parcel of what has happened. See, the thing about this book is this. Let me break this down a little bit harder for those of you out here who like to think about theology. If I wanted to go back further and go back to the Reformation, I could talk about this with Calvinism and predestination and how to use predestination to make sure that Black people wasn't really human. Okay, we could go that route. We could talk about how this gets embedded into the slave trade. We can talk about how Enlightenment thought goes into evangelical thought and evangelical theology and influences it in such a way that you don't have to consider those people. Or you can think about this in terms of how evangelicals treated missionary work and how everybody else is on the outside. See, these are the hard things that it's really hard if you are in the movement, if you are evangelical, if you believe Jesus is Lord and you had a born again experience, everything else. I'm taking you out of that space and I'm putting you in a hard space of truth that you cannot feel your way out of. And that's real. That's the tough part. You have to this book is about rejiggering thinking and rejiggering the ways in which you've been taught what this movement is and how you see sin. Because if you see sin as something that's individual and not corporate and not structural, then you get snowed by everything that they've told you.
Man, and I think, so when you say that last part, it reminds me in your book how you pinpoint the individualism, American value, and connect it to leaders such as Billy Graham, for example. Yep. So can you just speak a little bit for our audience? Can you talk a little bit more about how individualism in America and how we've elevated certain leaders in the evangelical faith, how that has impacted what you talk about in your book?
It's because you don't think about people as, having sin. So in other words, this is why, so I'm going to talk about it in very contemporary terms and not historical terms. It is why evangelicals could give a pass to Donald Trump, because you could just say Donald Trump is what, what's his name in First Baptist of Dallas said, oh, he's a baby Christian. He doesn't know anything. We have to work with him. And so you let Donald Trump off of all the terrible things he says about racists, or you let him talk about grabbing the pee and nobody cares and they still think he's the man of God and he's Cyrus, all right? Because God can forgive that sin. See, this is the thing in evangelicalism. Men always get forgiveness for sin. Ted Haggard gets forgiveness for sin for, running around with the gay guy and doing drugs and everything else, but they still kick him out because he's gay. All right. And you can't have a gay guy running your biggest church and being the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. Okay. So you can't do that. And so we can talk about individual sin all the time, but we can't talk about the structural kind of sin, the structural kinds of sin that basically right now, I just got through talking to somebody about this, the ways in which structural sin builds up systems. So right now you're seeing a whole bunch of evangelical leaders doing these woke conferences, right? They hate the word woke right now. It's either CRT or woke are the two things that evangelicals are selling right now that they are scamming folks on, okay? And the scam is this: look at all this stuff. You can't think about this. You're not racist. We've done everything for those people. We're not this way. We just want everybody to love Jesus. But if Jesus is white all the time, and Jesus is the one that you want to show as the representation of what everybody should be, and you can't be anything else but accepting white Jesus and white evangelicalism, then you have a problem. Because it's all about the individual. It's not about you thinking about what is our world like? What is it like for African Americans or, people trying to get over the border, Latinos and others? What is it like for Asians to have to go through persecution, or those Asian women who were killed in Atlanta by a Bible dude who couldn't control his sexuality, who was ashamed of it and had been made ashamed of it in the church? I can go on forever. Don't even let me get started. I'm just showing you right now about how that is. So they won't take responsibility for all of that stuff. It's about, oh, he did that thing. We don't have anything to do with that, but they do.
Wow. Yeah, when you said the word responsibility, but then also you said structural sin.
And I hate structural.
Yeah. So when you said structural sin, the biggest connection that I had there that is a biblical principle is the concept of generational sin.
Yes, right? But here's the thing. Okay. You know who always has generational sin? Everybody else except white people. White people don't have generational sin, because this is why they don't want you to learn this history right now, because they want you to learn about the generational sins of white people. Okay, so understand what the game is. The CRT game is basically, we don't want to hear about this. We don't want to teach these kind of histories. We don't want to make, there was just a thing yesterday in the news about, we don't want to make white people feel bad. So we can't teach this kind of stuff. But see, generational sin means that it's not just, it's not individual, it's corporate. But every time generational sin gets talked about in the church or in a Pentecostal church or something like that, it's about sexual sin or, murder or all these other things that are done to individuals, but it's not about your daddy was a slaver. Your mother owned slaves and sold them. Your mother watched as your great-great-grandmother watched as somebody got raped and then sold her kids off. That's generational sin.
Right.
But that's not the generational sin they want to deal with. If you've ever heard anybody talk about that generational sin from a pulpit, please let me know so I can congratulate them, because that's not what they talk about.
Yeah. So I definitely hear you saying that structural racism, right, is very much attached to the biblical concept of generational sin. However, it seems like the white evangelical, on average, the church is not comfortable with talking about racism as
Absolutely.
a sin, whether it's individual, structural, generational.
None of it.
Okay.
None of it, because that would make them complicit. And while evangelicals like to feel like they're persecuted all the time, in fact, they are the ones who are doing the persecuting. And that's really, I noticed that, again, this is going to be hard for people to hear, but somebody's got to brush it away for you so you can see clearly and plainly. And I think that's part of what this book does, is help you to see clearly and plainly. There's so much more behind this book that I could have written about, to talk about the ways in which evangelicals were complicit in lynchings, and complicit in the Ku Klux Klan, complicit in things like, the Citizens Council. They were the people who were sitting there screaming when, people try to get into schools in Little Rock and other places. For all we know, they were born again believers that drowned Emmett Till and churchgoers. So it's hard to understand that, because the way that evangelicalism presents itself is this pristine thing that we can just save the world and save the country if everybody will just love Jesus and be, and love the country and pay attention and love your families and everything else. All that stuff is true. It's not a lie. But what the problem is when you don't deal with this and you can become complicit in these systems of oppression, then you have to think about, well, what is evangelicalism really doing?
Yeah. So before I ask my next question, I actually just want to pause. It's going to sound like a commercial break, but for those of you, we have about 19 attendees on right now, and I'm sure they'll continue to go up. But I like to keep the chat warm. So I know a lot has already been talked about in the first, segment. And so use that chat to put your comments, and I'll elevate some comments. And then also if you go to the bottom, it says Q&A, that's where you should put your questions. We will leave time at the end for a Q&A portion with Dr. Butler. And so we want to make sure you can already start to get those questions there so that we can respond to what you are listening to and what your thoughts are. So that's the commercial break. Okay, so now it was awesome to hear just a little bit about your background and specifically knowing that you studied at Fuller, and you talked about kind of how that led to your understanding of where you actually stood theologically. So I'm interested to know, I know in your formation, my husband also graduated from seminary, and in your formation, you probably read a ton of biblical commentaries. You were told history.
See, now this is where you're wrong. Can I reframe your question for you?
Okay.
I gotta cut you off here, because this is gonna hurt your feelings, but not in the way you think. It is always very interesting to me when people of faith want to talk to me about this book. You're more interested in how I've studied the Bible than when I've studied history. And this is fascinating to me because it tells me something about how you're trained to think. And so don't take this the wrong way, but I'm gonna break this down for you. I'm a historian. I tell this people all the time, I am the president of the American Society for Church History. I am not a theologian. What I do is history, and I may do a smattering of historical theology, but I am not a theologian. See, theologians get to just say, I think God is like this. I can use 4 books and I can write a book. Historians really have to go read a whole bunch of stuff and look in archives and do real work, okay? So when I was at Fuller, the reason why I just, I cut all that off, I took Greek, I did not take Hebrew. I didn't do biblical commentaries and all that stuff. I had I had Bible class, I had Old Testament class, fine. I had a great Old Testament teacher, had New Testament class, great. I spent my time on history because that's where I needed to have the knowledge that I have. So I'm a 2,000-year trained Christian historian, origin till today. So I can talk about all of that. And that really helped me write this book in a different way. So it's not just Fuller, it's actually Vanderbilt, because Fuller just set down the frame. And then what Vanderbilt did was give me the training to do that 2,000 years of church history. But where I find my locus, where I found my framework of what I do in my work as an American religious historian and African-American religious historian is 19th and 20th century American religious history, which is why I could breeze through that book like this, because I had already done that work. Now, what am I saying outside of me? Okay, I'm saying something much bigger. History is really important. What evangelicals have done is to make you think that theology is so important that you don't look at the history that's behind the theology. And every theology has a history. Every theology has a history about how it comes together and why it comes together. And I think that we cannot separate the two. It's not that I don't think theology isn't great. I just think that theologies come out of historical context. And so when we're talking about white theologies, whether that be Calvinism or Arianism and all these other kinds of things, we have to look at the context in which they come out of and how they get appropriated into the present, or how they don't get appropriated into the present in a certain kind of way. So I mean to take your question, but it's like, I can't let you ask me this question this way, because it always is, it's a trap, right? Because it's the trap of how they want to frame you. And I'm like, this is a history book. It's not an op-ed. It's not theology, although I reveal some things about theology in it. It's a history. And that history informs how evangelical theology plays out.
Yeah, that's good. Not trying to trap you purposefully.
I know, but I was just like,
but you answered my question. So yeah, that's the thing is, I think what lies in my question is that the way that you write it, it's very clear that it's not based on like commentaries, right? And that's
why would I use a biblical commentary to talk about this? Why would I?
Right.
I mean, this is the other trap. You can't talk to me about a book that, and this is gonna make everybody mad if you're a real Christian out here. That we don't even know who might have written it. I mean, like Hebrews could have been written by a woman. So let's start there. Okay. So that's not even in most of the commentaries of what evangelicals want to talk about. How do we get to the words of Jesus? There's a document called Q. You went to seminary, you know what this is, and that's where this gets built from. So if we're going to talk about all this stuff, I don't need to talk about scripture. Why am I going to talk about scripture when I got 400 years of bad history in America? Why would I do that? There's no reason. I could talk about everything that's happening here. And I'm not going to biblical authority to this. That's not my issue. My issue is this you? Is this what you've done? Is this what your history is? Is this how you use the Bible to enslave? Is this how you use the Bible to keep women down? Is this how you use the Bible to say that Black people shouldn't be in certain places? Is this how you don't read the Bible when you're supposed to welcome the stranger and you blocking the border?
So do I hear you saying that, and I see how you talked about tactics and strategies, right? How the Bible was a tool for an agenda sometimes, right?
A very big agenda.
Can you just name that just for the people, like if you could pinpoint, because there's a lot of agendas like little a. Do you see a big A agenda?
I mean, the big A agenda is this. I mean, as a woman, I'm gonna tell you what the big A agenda is: patriarchy. How do you keep women in their place? Wives, be submissive to your husbands as Christ is to the church. And your husband is supposed to be submissive to Christ, but he ain't even submissive half the time because he don't really give a damn. So, I'm like, this is a thing. And there's a big conversation right now about complementarianism, how other women, my first book is all about women in the Church of God in Christ and how they have to make a separate system because Kojic said women can't be ordained. And so women have to find a way to do that, but women were also oppressing other women and using scripture to do it. So, I mean, I know that the Bible is a tool and a way in which people really find sustenance in it. I don't take that lightly. That is a very serious thing. But you also have to realize the ways in which scripture is used. And so I think one of the things we have to think about is if you just use simply to think about slavery and how slavery is justified. And I start out, if you read the book, what I start off that chapter with about slavery, with Lecrae having to be up there getting embarrassed with Giglio and Tom Cathay or whatever his name is, that's over what's the name, Chick-fil-A, and how they put him in a bad position. And here's the white pastor saying, oh, this was a blessing for white people. Well, no kidding. Sure was, because guess what? We can still look at the disparity between white wealth and Black wealth in this country and realize that, gee, it really was a blessing for white people, but it sure as hell wasn't for Black people.
Wow. Yeah. I want people to just sit.
We can't hear
people saying amen in the comments to some of the things that you said, right? And then I see questions have already started to populate, and just keep them coming. I see that there's one attendee who's got 3 just ready to go. But before we get to those questions, there's a piece where you talk about the other, but you specifically talked about it with the context of Billy Graham. But I want to take it and spread it to other people, that as you trace the history and you've pinpointed the other, I'm interested to know. So for Billy Graham, you said it was communists, Catholics, and immigrants, right? Are there other people that have been in the historical line that have perpetuated racism as it comes to the
You should always consider Black people are always the other. Okay. I mean, look, what's the name said it yesterday? African Americans vote a different way than Americans. Mitch McConnell just told you right there, right off the square. He's not an evangelical in that sense, but he told you right then and there. I mean, the other has been a lot of people, a lot of time. I mean, if we want to go to the 70s, we can talk about the other as being, people who are gay, LGBTQ. When this is the 80s and we're talking about, when AIDS got started, they were definitely othered. They were talked about as though they were dirty or something had happened to them. They were othered. If we could talk about immigrants right now, immigrants has been a constant for that. We could talk about Muslims. Muslims have been the big other since the 1990s. And, they weren't on the radar screen before, but they started getting on the radar screen in the 90s, and then that's it. The other now is pretty much like liberals or anybody who doesn't like evangelicals. Essentially, the other is people who are, different, right? And different in certain kinds of ways. The other is trans people. I mean, I can just go on forever. I mean, pick another, because anything that's other than white constructed family can be othered. And the only way that you get into that, the only way you can be accepted is if you're in those spaces. And this is, this is the hard part, because I was in those spaces too. You have to conform. And if you don't conform in certain ways, even if you're talking about race or if you're doing all this other stuff, there comes this moment where, people might get tired. Or unless they're really into thinking about, we need to do this work. And I'm not saying that all white evangelical churches are like this. I'm just saying there always comes this moment that everybody has to think about it. So let me give you an example that's a more concrete example. I'm thinking about when the Southern Baptists this summer were having their convention. And, there has been a lot of talk about CRT, and some of the major leaders, that Black leaders have been in the Southern Baptist Convention, like Dwight McKissick, were talking about, if certain people get elected, we coming out, we're leaving. And some Black pastors have already left. Now, it's hard for me, and I like Dwight McKissick, I've talked to him before. It's hard for me to think about, how would I be in a denomination like that? How do you become a Black pastor in a denomination that exists only because they wanted to keep slavery intact? How do you stay there? I mean, that's a real calling, because I don't have that calling. I don't, and will never have that calling. But, it's really difficult to think about the ways in which people of color have suffered in these churches by being othered every day. Or there's a story I tell, and I think it's Trillia Newbell, who I tell the story about, where she's talking and the man says, well, you're not like this. You're not a Black, he's like, because you're Black, you're not this way. I don't consider you to be even like a white person. I don't consider you to be a person. The fact that somebody can actually say that after you spoke at a church, that's crazy. Or you can't get married here because we only serve, Christians. And if you want to have an interracial marriage, you must not be a Christian. This is the kind of stuff we have to contend with. And that's why I think what's important for me about the book is, yes, it's written in such a tone that I'm really pushing, but I'm pushing for a reason. You got to push because it's very hard for people to kind of really grasp this stuff unless you get in their face right here and not here, but here and say, this is what this is. Now you have to think about it. Now you have to decide what you're going to do about it. Now you have to decide how you live in these spaces or what you do about these spaces.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate it because you were right here, you know. There was you couldn't move because like you were right here speaking truth. And one of the things that really sat with me was as you started to go through talking about MLK, I started to like, it might have been a little bit of trauma, but I started to get flashes from my 8th grade, 11th grade history classes, where just like white Jesus, MLK was put here. And I remember as I got older, I started to realize like people really didn't like MLK during the time. No, they did not.
They celebrated when he was assassinated, okay?
Right. So can you speak a little bit to how the church has responded? You talked about it in your book, but just for the people who are here, how the church has responded to this like this ideal MLK, the safe MLK.
I can't talk about it we can't say the church here. I need to rephrase this in a different way. How has the church responded to the Republican construction of MLK? Okay. And that's really important because see, when we say church, we got to say, what kind of church? What church are we talking about? What we're talking about here is evangelicalism. And so evangelicalism is embedded in republicanism. And that's part of what this book is about, is that how evangelicals are very political, even though they want you to believe that they're not political. They're very political. And so part of this has to do with, and I talk about this in the book, this sort of colorblind evangelicalism that starts in the late 60s when they realized that, oh, shoot, we're going to have to integrate. We got to figure out how we're going to do this. But, you know, one of the things I think is really interesting, if you think about making MLK Day a holiday, this is what I call the deneutering of MLK. In other words, they don't want to hear all the hard things that he said. They just talk about, you know, how nice he was. And he talked about not the color of your skin, but the content of your character, which means we could, again, whitewash everything. That's not what he was talking about. That's not what that whole speech is talking about, you know, on the lawn at the March on Washington. You know, the I Have a Dream speech is not just about everybody's going to live together in perfect harmony. No, it's about the debt that America has not paid to Black people. They have written, checkmark insufficient funds. But the king that begins to be built up by whites, and especially white evangelicals and others, is this benign figure who never says anything wrong. So I can prove this to you by, if you ever go to the Bible Museum in DC, there's a picture in the 20th century thing where Billy Graham is on one side and King is on the other, and they look at each other as though they work together to make the civil rights movement, when that's the furthest thing from the truth. Billy Graham was all for the okie doke. Okay. He did not want to do this. And if you want to watch something on Billy Graham, there's a great PBS specials online. I was on it. I helped them produce it. Watch this thing, because Billy Graham is where everything begins for evangelicals in the 20th century about politics. They're there before, but he's really the political person. So when King asked him, don't go on stage with Governor Price Jones, don't go on stage with this man, he does it anyway. What church did Billy Graham belong to? The most racist church he could possibly belong to. W.A. Criswell's church, First Baptist, which actually happens to be the church of Robert Jeffress right now. Billy Graham is not the nice, benign figure everybody wants to make him as. So we can take that forward and start to think about all these other, white evangelicals. If we want to talk about Falwell's only Black friend was E.V. Hill. And E.V. Hill is there because E.V. Hill is a Black Republican. Okay. And that's part of the whole thing. So while, he's talking about moral majority, he's also saying, we're going to support the apartheid government of South Africa. People don't remember these things. They look at Pat Robertson and others and think they have Black sidekicks. They must be nice. No. Pat Robertson comes up with Christian Coalition, which figures out ways in which to, subvert elections, and to figure out ways in which they pass out stuff to tell everybody to vote. So when we're talking about who gets othered and how this works, I think what we have to talk about is the complicity of evangelicals to be involved in the political process that makes them culpable and part of the mess that we're in right now. Because they're the same people that don't want to take a vaccine.
Yeah. Yeah. And, look, to everyone who's here, like, I will say, like, I am an evangelical. And this is just like, I'm taking it all in, right? So sometimes there's going to be pauses and you're going to hear.
I know, I'm seeing you trying to think through it like, whoa.
Yeah. Like, I'm just taking it all in, but you're going to hear me say the church, because like, when I say the church, I'm talking about all of it, because I guess I'm interested to know from your perspective, Dr. Butler, outside of evangelicals, because in my mind, I think a lot of groups were very complicit in slavery and racism. So that's why I say the church, because I'm like, they all erase,
United Methodists or Presbyterians. I mean, they got their own issues. I wrote about evangelicals for a very big reason. Evangelicals are the ones who are most vocal about who they are politically, and secondarily have insinuated themselves into the political process in such a way that they have become this powerhouse. And so that's why it's important to write about them. You can't just say that, all the rest of them are complicit too. Yeah, they are in different sorts of ways. But, Presbyterians tried to work this out about race. Other churches tried to work this out about race, whether they were in the National Council of Churches or something else. But evangelicals didn't want to do that. They made the National Association of Evangelicals and didn't invite no Black denominations.
Wow. So, Dr. Butler, I got to jump in and ask this question because you just triggered my memory from reading the book. There's a part in the book where you talk about how, like, the Presbyterians, I think it was the Episcopalians, they're like the white elite churches. Yeah. And that evangelicalism came out of like these working class white people who were trying to get power, and like it was also all about power. So could you talk a little bit more? Yeah, about
if we just look at this in terms of presidents, most presidents have been Episcopalian, some have been Presbyterian. You've not had presidents who've come out of evangelical. Bush was probably the first one that was there, but Bush had his own money, but he had an Episcopalian background, right? Trump is like your first prosperity gospel president. That's pretty much who he is, because if he went to church at, Norman Vincent Peale's church, he's basically a prosperity gospel guy. That's why he had all those prosperity gospel people around him. So I think it's really important to even think about it. If we put it in present day terms, what has happened in evangelicalism, and this is actually another kind of interesting way to think about it, is that evangelicals and Pentecostals came together. I kind of flattened things a little bit in the book to kind of put Pentecostals with evangelicals for a reason, because by the time we get to Trump, all the Pentecostals are running the game. It's not the regular evangelicals anymore, like James Robinson and everything else. They take a back seat to Paula White. That kills them, because it's like, you mean Paula White up here on the stage praying instead of, me? How come the regular white dudes don't get to do it? Trump was smart. I'm going to give Trump credit. Everybody talks about how dumb Trump is. Trump is smarter than Fox, because he knew if he got the D list would make him the A list, because the D list loved him so much that they would do anything for him. And they did it. And so that's why he could get all those kinds of people around him. But it really didn't start with Trump. It actually started back in 2008 when they got Sarah Palin, who was really Pentecostal, but tried to play it off by saying evangelical. But the way I said, here's the difference between evangelicals and Pentecostals. If Sarah Palin had been a Pentecostal, been an evangelical, she would have said to her husband, let's pray about me being the vice president. Okay, let's pray together. Let's talk about this. Let's see what God's will is for my life. The moment she got asked to be the vice presidential nomination, she acted like a Pentecostal woman. God called me. You're going to have to deal with that. And that was that.
That reminds me of the shift. So I come out of policy. That's how I met Langston. I was in policy school, and we talked about how, when a president, before they become president, where they stand, right, in order to even get voted, right? They're like staunch Republicans, staunch Democrats, but then once you see them in office, they start moving towards the middle. And when you just brought that up, it reminded me of that same shift, that people might be like, oh, I'm an evangelical in order to get elected.
Yeah.
Is that what I hear you saying? Okay.
Oh yeah, they did it. I mean, listen, when Ronald Reagan said to them, I can't, you can endorse, I can't, how did he say it? I got to remember how it goes. The famous phrase where he talks about, you can't endorse me, but I endorse you. And when he said that, that gave evangelicals that moment to say, oh my God, he loves us. We're going to get behind this guy. And so what do? They make sure that the born again president loses. The born again president is Jimmy Carter. Ain't nobody asked Reagan if he was born again. He was divorced. I mean, if you just, let's do this, okay? I got an even better way to do this for you. Ronald Reagan married and divorced. If you're a real evangelical, that bothers you, but they voted for him anyway, okay? So that's number one. Then we get to, Obama, and it's just terrible because he's a Black man, but we can't get rid of him. So what do we do when you get to Trump? It's like, we'd have had enough, and we can't have a Black man in office anymore. We can't have a woman in office. We're not doing none of this. We will take the thrice married, pea-grabbing, everything else reality TV show star, because we really just want a white guy. Okay? So understand that the evangelicals before this, people were disqualified because they cheated or did whatever, but the bar kept getting lower and lower and lower till you didn't even have a bar. The bar is on the floor. I mean, basically the bar is under the floor on Trump, but evangelicals took him, and they still are his strongest supporters.
Yeah, one of our
says no bar, right?
Yeah, there's no
bar. It ain't no bar.
Yeah,
there's no bar for Trump. So this is what I'm saying. It's like, how can you talk about what morality is? And like, you're supposed to be with your wife and all this other stuff. And they just, they've had all kinds of excuses for Trump. They didn't used to have those excuses for leaders. Leaders would get sat down for sexual sin all the time, like Ted Haggard and everybody else. But for Trump, those of us who thought, maybe evangelicals are going to do the right thing when the pea grabbing thing came out in October, we thought maybe this is going to change everything. No, they went in there and voted for him. So I mean, this is where I'm at. This is the connection in the book that I think everybody misses. It's one thing, the racism is stark, but the other thing you have to really consider is that this morality that evangelicals have talked about is just a shield to get power. It's not about all this other stuff. I mean, because if it was about the other stuff, you would live up to the other stuff, right? You would hold everybody to it, but you're not holding your leaders to it. You don't hold evangelical men to it. And so I'm like, is this you? This is who you are. You're not asking us to, you're asking us to accept people that in the past you would say you would never accept. I mean, if Billy Graham said he never wanted to be alone with a woman, and then we go from Billy Graham to where we are now, that's crazy.
Yeah, when you said this earlier, and I wrote it down, I was like, hurry up and write this down again. But you just said it again, so I'm going to say it again. You said morality is a shield, but this time you said to get powers, which automatically I got this visual of like power being the sword, right? And as you started to describe the interplay between morality, politics, and racism, it felt as though when we started talking about a bar, there is a bar. And I hear you saying it's the white race, right? As long as he's white, he doesn't have to be moral.
Everybody else
has to be moral.
Everybody else is subject to the law if you are not white. Okay, so understand this clearly. The moral part, all of that stuff, well, we can talk about Black people being immoral, and even if the statistics are wrong about this is the thing that gets said all the time. Somebody just said it this summer. Oh, Black unwed mothers and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, what you talking about? The birth rate has gone down tremendously. I mean, it's this fantasy idea that they have in their head of the Moynihan report, but except it's like, Black people are just, murderers and all this other stuff. That's why you hear about the crime is so bad in the inner city, and there's this and there's that. And, some of this may be true, but the other part of it is like, but why does this always have to focus in on the people of color instead of white people doing stuff? I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's like, you can have, Kyle Rittenhouse. I mean, here is a moment. They put up millions of dollars for this kid. And now he's going through and appearing at churches and everything else because he was supposed to be a hero. He killed 2 people. He went out with a gun and shot people in the street. He didn't even need to be at that thing. That's what the police are for. He's a vigilante, but he is an evangelical hero now.
Yeah. I just want to add just a thought that I had with you bringing that up, Dr. Butler. When religion gets violent, it's really dangerous for the society.
That's right.
When the religion starts to condone or absolve certain people, oh, it's not murder because of this, or it's coded as, that goes back to what you were saying, if you're white, you're not guilty.
Yeah.
That's dangerous for a lot of people because religion, as a historian, you know this, religion has a bad history when it comes to things like genocide and slavery and its own types of fascism and things like that.
And if you haven't been paying attention to all these things that these people have been saying, who were either at 1-6 or everything else, I mean, my friend Peter Manseau did a great piece in the Washington Post about tracking this guy who got radicalized on Facebook and showed up at the insurrection and had his Jesus shirt on and everything, and then gets arrested. I mean, how many pastors there's several pastors who've been arrested that were in the, storming the Capitol. So I'm just saying, like, where we at? And these are people who also love guns very much. So, babies, guns, and Jesus. I went to a Palin rally in Idaho Iowa when everybody thought she might run, and they were selling these things out there, babies, guns, and Jesus, and all this stuff. And I'm just like, wow, Christianity and no abortion and Jesus and guns. This is where we at.
Yeah, and when you say morality is like a shield, and then as you start to describe it, I'm like, a shield is actually too solid for the way that I hear you describing evangelical morality, because it's something that shifts and changes.
Oh no, but you gotta, no. This is where you gotta watch some old movies, okay?
Okay, I'm ready.
So when you watch those old Roman movies, when the guys hold the shield and all the centurions come together and they're doing it and they move like a turtle, and they get them all together and they move and they do their shield. So you can switch your shield. You can do stuff with your shield. You can move it around. You can use it as a weapon. And it still blocks you and it still keeps the blows off. That's what morality is doing. It is malleable. It can move. And when you bring everybody together like that in a block, that is a formidable block, a weapon.
That visual is helpful. I appreciate you walking with me in the analogy. And then, so I'm going to make a slight shift because I saw a question that's leading me to want to shift. So we've talked, like you said it from the beginning, you're a historian. And we know that a lot of people are having conversations. Very few are having them from the historical perspective in the way that you did, which is, there was a gap that you filled with your book, right? Yeah. And so imagine that everyone that's here and that is listening are the people who are steeped in this diversity, equity, inclusion work that's talking about being anti-racist. The terminology has changed through the decades, but the problem has stayed the same. Let's be honest, right? So what does your book speak into that space for people? I'm not talking about white evangelicals, but it could be white evangelicals, but people who care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. What does your book speak into that space that they might be missing?
I think what it speaks into that space is you understanding what the deeper history is and why people behave the way they do. Because if you don't understand the history and you're just doing this DEI work and you don't understand why the racial structures are there in the first place and how they came about, then it's very difficult to do this DEI work because you don't know what you're dismantling. How are you going to know what you're dismantling unless you know what the construction is?
Yeah, I hear that. And then is there an additional piece? So I hear you saying you have to know your history in order
you have to know your history first of all, but then secondarily, you have to be able to use that history and wield it. You have to have your facts in front of you. If we're going to talk about DEI work and somebody saying at the firm, well, I don't really, believe in all this and I don't understand the inequity and I don't understand what you're talking about here. You have a tool that you can use. Or in your church where they're saying that, I don't understand why we should, let people have Juneteenth at the church. Well, this is a book that'll help you understand why you should have Juneteenth, right? Or why you should, think about that everybody is not going to feel the same way about the 4th of July that you do, right? Or how that, you might not feel the same kind of way and vote the same kind of way as somebody else in your church who's Republican. Or that you feel, or let's talk about something really real that people are having to contend with right now. The fact that you think that 1/6 was an insurrection instead of God calling people to go to the Capitol. That'll help you think about it. I mean, DEI work is really interesting because it depends on what space you're in or whatever. But, for evangelical churches, I feel like DEI work is like, how much are they going to take before they lose their minds? How committed are they to doing that work? How committed are they to looking at the history of how they come about, or the ways in which they have people at the church, oh, we're going to have gospel music Sunday, and everybody gets to get up there and do gospel music. But when somebody asks them, can we do, something else, or can we, oh, no, we don't want to do that. Or we don't want that speaker here because, it might be too much. Like I would be that speaker. But, what do you do, right? Can you deal with the hard things? Or let's just say the experience I had when I was in Pentecostal church, this church that I went to when I was in seminary, that people were getting upset because there was interracial dating. Well, we want the kids to be together, but we don't want them to be dating each other. That's all holdovers from slavery. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that you kind of segued us into that next piece that you said, history can be something that we can wield, right? You talked about how people wield morality as a shield, right? But I hear you saying history is something that can be wielded within the church and the evangelical context. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Because we got some people in here, myself included, selfishly, that I'm interested in knowing, not just having someone sit and read this book, but if I just give this book to somebody, which
if you give the book to somebody that just tell them, but you need to use excerpts from the book. You also need to be doing one very, I think, important thing. And you did it at the beginning, and I'm not criticizing you, but I think this is really important. Everybody wants to put everything on the ground of the Bible. The Bible is not applicable here. And that's a hard thing to say. The Bible has things to say about how you treat people, how you should be, or whatever. But when we're dealing with the issue of racism, I always like to use the scripture. Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman. He don't want to give her nothing to eat. He's like, oh, this is She's like, look, the dogs eat from the table. What? Jesus was a racist. Jesus had to be told. I know it's really hard for everybody to hear, but Jesus was acting like a racist there because he didn't like that woman. She wasn't one of them. And now he gets told by her, he's like, oh, wait a minute, I'm wrong. I love that piece because that's a piece where Jesus is having to deal with a woman. He gets called out by a woman. He has to really rethink where he is. And like, this is bad. So when you talk about me using scripture, I can do scripture. I can do that. But I think it's really important to say, now let's talk about this in the context of our history. Let's talk about the context of this church. Who are the people here that you are revering and talking about all the time? And the people that you're asking us to read. What is their policy about racism? Am I having to listen to somebody like a John MacArthur, who definitely is like a racist? Or what books do you have us reading? Are we reading, other people's books of color who are writing, Christian writers who are Black? Are we, we talk about Jamar Tisby, or we talk about some other people, or do you just want to ignore that? I mean, I think it's really important to start to call people out on their stuff. Because if you're in this church and all you get to see is white theologians and white guest speakers and white materials that they use for the kids all the time, things that are culturally white and not, and not thinking about being inclusive to everybody who's in the congregation, then ask yourself the question, do they really care about anybody else, or do they care about whiteness?
Yeah, I have just one last question that you've mentioned, and that last thing that you said, I think is huge. Earlier, you talked about this piece of niceness. You've mentioned comfort, and then at the end, I feel like you named it, and you said whiteness. Yeah. And a lot, oftentimes, white people don't believe they have a culture, and they just do things, culture. But they have a culture. It's all over the place, right? Yeah. And so you've also pinpointed within the evangelical church how white culture comes through, but then you also talked about representation when it comes to curriculum and the things that you're putting in front of people from age nursery all the way up. So I just wanted to name some of those things that you called out and those trends. And then you also pulled out, you said in the Bible, you were talking about a story just for the people who want to go back and look. Can you, I mean,
Syrophoenician woman, just go read. You can find it. Y'all all scripture people, go read it.
There you go. There you go. Awesome. I think that's going to be really helpful. And then also in the chat, if any of you are interested in commenting on some of the things that you're noticing, I know some people are saying like amen and yes. And I see there's a comment that says they just call it normal society. Everything that is white culture is what they try to call normal and the rest of us are other. So I'm just elevating some of those comments. I'm going to go ahead. Langston, is it good to go to the Q&A looking at the time?
Yeah, so want to be respectful of Dr. Butler's time, but we'll get to some of the questions that were in the Q&A. And Danica Carey is asking, do you know of any white churches that are, I guess in an authentic way, trying to address generational sins?
No, not like that. No. Yeah, I know plenty of churches want to talk about generational sin all the time, but I do think the kind of churches you should be looking at are the churches that are working on racial justice. And I have a friend, Gerardo Marti, who's a sociologist who writes about this, and I can put his name in the chat. And because I'm in Philadelphia, and the way I do this, Gerardo Marti. And he's a good person, I think, to talk about this because he has a book about Trumpism and evangelicalism. And I think that he would be he's a good resource for that. There's churches that are trying to do this, in various areas of the country. And I think that, one of the important things is that everybody doesn't do it perfectly. But I also am very critical of the churches that try to do it like a whitewash way. In other words, we're going to put up some people here and make it look good. That's kind of like I feel like Hillsong is sometimes. Yeah. And then people don't get real power. I think the question is, do you have Black leadership? Is the Black leadership included in everything? Are they a part of things? Or are they just window dressing? These are the kind of questions you have to ask. Or, it's not just African-Americans, it's Latinos, it's Asians. What makes a truly multicultural church is the question. And how does that work out well?
Yeah, I'm wondering, I asked this question to my colleagues who work in academia, and I say, can PWIs be saved because of all of their histories with slavery and racism and things like that? And I'm wondering, institutionally, I'm not talking about people, can white evangelicalism, can it as a concept, right, as a construct itself, I'm not talking about individuals, can it be salvaged?
I don't know. I mean, it really depends a lot on what happens politically here in the next 4 years. It may end up being morphing into a fascist movement of a church. I don't know. I mean, it really depends on what happens here and how power gets attributed. I think we have a bigger question about democracy right now. The question is, do evangelicals really want to have a democracy? I don't know. I mean, right now, if you ask me, I would say the answer is no. No, they want freedom for themselves. They want freedom to do certain things, but, they want to be able to continue to, many of them still want to continue to meet for church and do all this other stuff and not wear a mask and not get a vaccine and do all this other stuff. And that's a problem.
And I have two more questions. The first one is from the chat, and it talks about, the history of genocide and enslavement and all those things. Is there a possibility for, Pamela is asking, is there a possibility for real justice given the history of injustice? And I guess that's related to the last question too.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like the question is, if we're going to talk about injustice, it's not just stolen land, it's stolen people. And so can either happen in this country without some kind of recognition of that? I think it's going to be very difficult. I look at, Desmond Tutu just passed away not too long ago, and who headed up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. At least they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We haven't had that. We ain't gonna get it. We could use the Truth and Reconciliation for the kinds of people who got killed between 1950 and 1970. And we haven't had that in America, let alone a Truth and Reconciliation Commission about slavery. I mean, everybody's been fussing about 1619. They can't even stand the 1619 book because we're talking about slavery and the effect of that on the country. But, when I think about, I have a chapter in the 1619 book on church. And one of the things I said in the book is like, Black people are the people, and the Black church is the space where demanded democracy from this country. We are the ones who demand democracy. We are the ones who have set the bar about this is what your democracy should be, and you ain't doing it.
Yeah.
And we have continued to question that the whole time. And so while evangelicals are talking about how much they love the nation and everything else, the Black church has had to fight for democracy every step of the way because it's had to in order to survive, because that was the only place that Black people could survive.
And my last question is about the Black church. And I have to bring this up because it's been all over social media with Michael.
That fool that spit on somebody?
Yeah.
Are we talking about him?
I got to ask you about that because before
he's a clown.
I know.
He's a clown. Let me just start off right here. He's a clown and a jackleg. And see, that kind of thing, let me say something about him because I think this is really important to hear in the context of this book. This is the kind of charlatan crap and chicanery that white thieving preachers do. And he just did the same thing so he could try to make some money. And now he apologized for it. But, you gonna hark on somebody and spit and put it in their eye and act like you Jesus? Hell no, you ain't Jesus. You ain't nobody. And see, when we keep running behind these kind of people, this is the same kind of crap that happens with evangelicals when they put too much into a leader and the leader turns out to be ain't nothing. Yeah. And I can say a bad word here, but I'm not. But basically this dude, I don't even know why people are sitting up under him. He's ignorant. And it's a ridiculous thing to have to look at people like him getting social media time because he's a clown. And a nasty clown on top of it. In this time of COVID and pandemic and spitting on people and thinking you anointed. He ain't anointed to do nothing but BS. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how else I could say it stronger. If he was here, I'd tell him myself.
I believe it.
I mean, it's so embarrassing. But see, these kind of churches, this church that he has and all these kind of Black big churches that are there, these people ain't doing nothing but emulating white preachers and trying to make their money and trying to be on a TV show. And I'm like, that ain't a God. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's not, it don't have nothing to do with Jesus. Jesus left the building from that place a long time ago.
Yeah. They
just didn't know it until he spit on somebody.
I worry about the social media addiction because it is an addiction, and like the desire to keep doing more and more and more, even in the pulpit for showmanship or showwomanship is just,
it would just be nice to hear somebody break down some scripture for a change and act like they really knew it.
Yeah.
Instead of performing. But this is a performance now. Yeah. And I think this is part of the issue. And we, it's not just white churches, it's Black churches. It's this kind of, celebrity popular culture that we deal with, that people feel like, it's that Instagram thing. I follow him, Preacher Sneaks, where they have all the expensive sneakers that the preachers wear.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He has pictures of all these preachers on Instagram, Preacher Sneaks. And there's an article about it, New York Times guy got interviewed about it. But it's really funny because it's a performance. It's about how you put yourself together. It's why Hillsong is falling apart right now, because they ain't worth shit. Sorry, gotta say it. Whatever. I mean, my friend sent me a Tom Ford book because we saw the Hillsong guy in New York who's not working there anymore. He had it on his coffee table. You can get it now for $39.99 at TJ Maxx in case y'all want one. So I said, I don't feel like I'm big enough for religion yet. I don't have that Tom Ford book. So she sent it to me for Christmas. And I cracked up laughing because I was like, this is the moment of just stupid excess. When you got a preacher that's got a coffee table design book on his desk about fashion, and instead of a Bible.
Yeah. It's the state of the culture. I lied. I have one more question.
Okay, it's the last one.
We are a Black book club, and you are a historian, but you know theology as well. I'm wondering for our audience, which is mostly Black, what are some go-to books?
Willie Jennings. I'm putting him in the chat. That's the person you want his book. He's at Yale Divinity School. He's got a good book on this. He's got 2 good books on race. That's who you want to talk to.
Okay.
Willie Jennings and J. Cameron Carter. She doesn't have her book out yet, but Ebony Marshall Herman. I think that's how you spell her last name. So those 3 people I would start off with.
Okay. Dr. Butler, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your commentary.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you for spending the time. Everybody, go buy the book. It's a quick read. It's not difficult. It's accessible. And there's a lot of good history in here that will make you think about the state of evangelicalism and really Christianity in America. So thank you, Dr. Butler. Thank you for being here this
You're
evening.
welcome. Thanks everybody for joining us.
And everyone else, don't leave yet. Dr. Butler, you're free to go. And because I want to tell everybody else in the chat like about the events that we have coming up next. So y'all wait. Listen, Black people are climbing Mount Everest and we're going to talk to them. So
y'all gonna talk to them? I might have to sign up for that because I don't even understand, but okay. Thanks, Ariel.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Dr. Butler.
So if y'all give me 1 second, I'm gonna share my screen and we'll talk about some of the upcoming events that we have going on here with Entrepreneurial Appetite. And here we go. And so, yes, we talked about the African American Sport podcast at the top of the show. It's a collaboration between myself, Dr. Brandon Crooms, and Dr. Alvin Logan, where we talk about contemporary issues facing African Americans in sport. And then, as you see here, next Thursday, I will be in Denver, Colorado, interviewing the Full Circle Movement. It's a group of Black folk who are climbing Mount Everest, and this conversation will feature we'll feature them, but it will also feature other Black outdoor entrepreneurs, such as Danica Carey, who's here today, asked a question in the chat, a good brother named Alex Bailey, who founded an organization called Black Outside. And so you can use that QR code to register for that event there. And we also have some other events that are coming up for Black History Month. We have 4 conversations. Typically we do 1 conversation a month, but because of Black History Month, we got to go all in. And so we have a conversation about love and liberation with the author Robin J. Hayes. We have a conversation about unshakable faith with Carrie Lattimore. We have a conversation about Black women, Black love, and America's war on African-American marriage with Dr. Diane Stewart. And then we have our final conversation with Dr. Dorian Williams Sr. about strategic planning for Black folk. Each of these conversations is in collaboration with some Black organization, some Black entity that is doing good work in the community to support Black communities. So I invite you all to participate in those. All of you who register for today, you should be getting emails about the upcoming events that you can register for. I also want to take a moment to note that we have started a Patreon where people can sign up as patrons for Entrepreneurial Appetite, and that gives you access to our monthly conversations. But for the month of February, since we do have 4 events and we have the event coming up next Thursday, if you register for the Patreon today, you'll get access to all of those upcoming events that we have coming up. It's only $5 a month. It goes to support what we do here at Entrepreneurial Appetite. It actually helped me pay for someone to do the editing of the podcast and the video production for our broader audience who likes to watch the downloads and things like that. So for your patronage, you get access to all of those conversations and then our monthly conversations moving forward. So you can use that QR code to join and be a part of our group. So I thank all of you for joining us. I appreciate you for being here. Please consider supporting Entrepreneurial Appetite as we strive to build community, promote intellectualism, and support Black businesses.